Hey everybody, we are back. It is Jack Murphy, and you are on the Jack Murphy Live podcast. You can find me, Jack Murphy, on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live. The website is jackmurphylive.com. You can find me on YouTube. My channel is actually starting to take off a little bit. Find me there, Jack Murphy Live. Also on Instagram, everywhere around the internet, Jack Murphy Live. Also, check out the liminal-order.com. The Liminal Order is a nationwide all-men's fraternity where we work hard to be the best version of ourselves that we can be so that we can be a better service to our family, our community, and hopefully one day the nation as well, too. And today I have a very special guest, somebody that I've been really looking forward to talk to. His name is Ryan Williams, and he is the president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the American Mind online journal. And the Claremont Institute's been in the news a little bit with some very interesting new engagement tactics and covering some interesting new content. But before we get to that, I want to learn just a little bit about you, Ryan, and have our listeners get to know you just a little bit, and also learn a little bit about what the Claremont Institute is. So first off, welcome. Thank you very much for coming on the show today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, awesome. Today is President's Day, so we're both squeezing this in between family and other things. So I really am grateful for your time. But tell me, you're the president of the Claremont Institute. How did you find yourself in that position? And then also, what is the Claremont Institute, and what are you guys up to?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the history of the place is kind of entwined with how I came to be here. We were founded by some graduate students in 1979, so we turned 40 last year. And they, at the waning years of the Carter administration, they thought that the conservative movement knew what it was against: communism abroad, maybe unlimited government at home, but didn't really know how it ought to think about its own history, its own principles, and what it should be for. So that was the project. They were all students of this great Lincoln scholar and scholar of America named Harry Jaffa, who passed away just 4 or 5 years ago. And I came out for graduate school. I'd gone to Hillsdale College for undergrad, and the president of Hillsdale was a former president of the Claremont Institute, Larry Yarvin. So that I sort of knew about the place, did one of our summer fellowships, the Claremont Institute, that is, and then took a year off after college, and then came out for graduate school, started working part-time. And then before I knew it, graduate coursework was up, and I was working full-time, eventually running most of our programs. Spent 4 years as chief operating officer, and then took over in September of 17. So that's sort of my history, and it speaks really to the Claremont Institute's history, which is we've always had a foot in academia or the academic world and a foot in the political world. We always thought that the battle of policy day to day is important, but really the battle of ideas is upstream from that battle. So we wanted to play in that space. So really, what we do more than anything else is we do a lot of teaching, especially in the summer, for people from beginning of career in policy and national intellectual life or political life, all the way up to mid-career. And then we have a fellowship for lawyers. We have a new one for speechwriters. We publish a quarterly review of books. And then you mentioned at the outset, one of our newer products is an online publication called The American Mind. And we do podcasts and conferences and all the rest, sort of think tank stuff. But we've never really done the sort of normal white paper policy work. Although we comment on politics and policies, we've always been interested in the battle of ideas part of conservatism, broadly speaking, and then going forward, who knows what? I think conservatism is probably a diminishing asset rhetorically. So we're all trying to figure out what comes next.
So, would you say yes to think tank, or no? You're not a think tank. You're something sort of nearby.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, labels are pretty descriptive because everyone knows what they are. So we're a think tank. Yeah. We just do a little less of direct policy work than your standard, Washington think tank. And we're way out here in California. So it's always kept us, I think, to our benefit outside the DC echo chamber.
Right. And in reference to Claremont and the folks that have been part of the Claremont network, I often hear this phrase Straussian applied to them. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. Broadly speaking, it's a way of looking at political philosophy or the history of ideas and how they influence politics. Strauss, really more than anyone else in the 20th century, revived this serious study of old books, whether it's Aristotle or Plato or Hegel or Nietzsche. He would say, and his students would say, they're really like in the political philosophical realm, there are probably 20 great thinkers. We should study them, and we should study them in a way that we think they still have something to teach us, rather than looking at them as sort of historical curiosities. So taking them seriously on their own terms. That was sort of out of fashion in the 20th century when Strauss took up that project, and historians and political philosophy students and those types, political thinkers, thought, Aristotle's interesting because he had this influence in his time and he's time bound. But to take him seriously as offering any wisdom or insight into politics now would be crazy. And Strauss said that was a great presumption. You should first try to understand them as they understand themselves before you think that you're better than them. You may come to that judgment eventually, but first, take them on their own terms.
Is there a difference between a West Coast Straussian and an East Coast Straussian?
Yeah, the categories are too facile, of course, or too you paint with a broad brush. But roughly speaking, the East Coast, I would say, is a little less political. Thinks that the American political project is fine as far as it goes, but kind of a materialistic thing, not that high, not that noble. It's good. It lets them do what they want to do, in terms of seeking the truth and philosophizing. And again, I should have a disclaimer. They don't all think this way. It's just a sort of broad brushstroke. And then the West Coast is really, I mentioned Harry Jaffa at the beginning. It's really, he and his students are West Coast Straussians, and then followers and fellow travelers, which is to say a little more comfortable with the scrum of American politics, had a little higher opinion of the American political project. I'm selling it short a little bit, a much higher opinion. It was, sure, we were liberal, small L liberal, in the political philosophical sense, but there's also the sort of moral architecture of the founding, the concern with happiness and virtue and nobility is there as well. It's just the rhetoric and the principles in their application is updated for a world very different than the ancient world.
Yes. It's interesting to me to think that studying ancient philosophers would be out of vogue. I guess I didn't really realize that, because as far as I've been paying attention to politics and philosophy, you can't walk 2 tweets without hearing somebody reference Nietzsche or Aristotle at this point in time.
Yeah, and I think to a large extent that's part of Strauss's legacy. Not just him, but he was probably the biggest player in the serious revival of that kind of study.
What would you say the general goal of the Claremont Institute is? Or how about 2 parts? What was the goal, and has it changed over time?
Our mission, has been to quote verbatim, just forgive me, listeners, to restore the principles of the American founding to their rightful and preeminent place in our national life. That's still our project, but restoring principles is a very different thing from offering an unchanging suite of policy prescriptions, or being unsensitive to the changing needs of politics and American cultural and political life. So I would say our adaptation is, how do you revive those principles, or how do you apply them? You never go back in politics, of course, in any real sense. We're not going to return to the 18th century or to that cultural and political landscape. But we think the principles are true, and so we have to figure out a way to reapply them, because if we don't, this experiment in self-government is going to turn into something else, and if it's not already well down that road.
Yeah. Do you guys do you come out in support of specific candidates?
No, I mean, we're a nonprofit, so we don't endorse candidates or legislation. We certainly comment on policies and candidates, but we're not in this PAC or C4 business at all. So we don't get directly involved in campaigns or policy work.
Well, to the extent that you can talk about it, in the early days of the 2016 Republican primary, did you guys have a general favorite?
By early days, yeah, I think the earliest indication of our general disposition was, I think, in the spring of 16. My colleague Bill Vogley wrote a piece for the magazine, I think for the online portion of the Claremont Review books. This was before the American Mind was up, where he said, why I'm anti-Trump. And he's kind of riffing off an old, I think he had in mind, Buckley way back in the day wrote a kind of defense of Joe McCarthy. And I think back then, I think Buckley was kind of anti McCarthy. I think Bill took that inspiration a bit, but he sort of laid out the case for, look, I mean, we're not quite sure what to make of Donald Trump, but the hysteria on what was then the early Never Trump right and the left about this guy is totally misplaced and sort of out of control. We ought to take a more sober view of him and the run of American political history, and we should we should have a little sobriety about the whole thing. And then a lot of that, I guess, culminated in the piece you want to talk about, I know, which everyone wants to talk about, which was Mike Anton's piece in September called The Flight 93 Election.
Yeah, so talk about that a little bit, would you? Because that seems to be an important piece, and people are still referencing it today.
Yeah, well, Mike had read Vogley's piece. I'm good friends with Mike, known him for over a decade now. And, Mike was sort of reassessing the field. He was a little more open to Trump. There was this sort of group of us who had been in and around the Claremont Institute for the better part of its history, who were sort of trading emails privately about how we ought to think about the Republican primary field and how we ought to think about Trump and the possibilities of a kind of populist outsider. And so that kind of all came to a head. Mike's told this story publicly, so I'm not speaking out of turn, but he originally sent us a piece called, I think it was called Towards a More Responsible and Coherent Trumpism, that ultimately my colleague Charles Kessler and some of the other editors decided wasn't quite ready or didn't quite fit with our editorial project. And that was probably 4 months before Flight 93. And then Mike wrote Flight 93, and we decided, either we'd come closer to him or we'd met somewhere in the middle, but we decided it was definitely worth publishing. And the rest is history. Rush Limbaugh read it live on air, crashed our website. And it's still our highest traffic piece, month in, month out.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine. I mean, it really set the tone for the urgency of the struggle in front of us here as a nation in terms of where we're going to go in the future and whether or not we could withstand yet another 4 to 8 years of sort of doing the same thing without some serious drastic damage coming to the country, the union, and everything else. And do you think that this Flight 93 article has helped coalesce some of your thinking or your network's thinking or the people who want to contribute to your publication? Has it become a rallying point? Did it push people away? What was the fallout or benefit to Claremont American Mind for running that?
Yeah, I think in many ways we're indebted to Mike. I mean, he, with that piece, sort of elevated our new baseline for public awareness. It wasn't without its, you asked if it alienated some folks, of course. I mean, Trump remains pretty polarizing, even on the right, as everyone can see. Mm-hmm. I think it's, it's kind of a more hysterical and vocal minority, always against him now on the right than it was back then. But, our constituencies, our fellows we've taught over the years, we have about a little over 700 alumni, our donor community, everyone who's liked what we've done. They were divided like the conservative movement at large on the question of Trump. I think a lot of them have come around as they've seen that Anton was not being. It was a polemical piece, so he was being a little hyperbolic. But his histrionics proved to be pretty prescient, actually, with the kind of insane reaction to Trump from the left. And I joke with some friends that and colleagues that one of Trump's great virtues is he's the unmasker. He pulls the mask down on the modern left, or at least the leading edge of modern leftism, and shows that Anton's predictions about how many more years of consistent rule by this group we could put up with. I think that was he was right and not hysterical or overblown.
No, and I think, not to cut you off there, but I think that the way that the Democratic primary is going right now only shows that he was even more accurate today than even before, like very predictive of the future. And for me, in my book, In Democrats are Deplorable, I really analyze a lot of these same a lot of these same trends. And I came to the conclusion that there was stopping the Democrats and stopping Hillary was like primary function number one. And Trump represented an excellent bomb to toss into the whole system, and at least, if anything, disrupt the flow and the nonstop march that would have only been more brazen had Hillary won. And I think it's really interesting to see now how the Democratic primary is revealing the fact that they've all continued to just skew left as hard as they can. Every single one of them on stage talking about free healthcare for illegal immigrants, and Bernie Sanders going on about how America is racist country from top to bottom, and Elizabeth Warren saying racism is horrible in the United States and getting worse every single day. And all of these things fit under this umbrella term that I've seen you guys use in your new pieces called multiculturalism. And you wrote a very eloquent piece. So did your chair as well. And I wanted to sort of dig into that a little bit. Could you just explain what you guys mean by multiculturalism now, and how is that piece that you wrote, is it reflective of sort of your central goals and motivation and sort of umbrella for the work that you're doing moving forward? Like how pertinent is it to the mission for Claremont?
Yeah, I think it's like I said, we're trying to figure out how we apply the principles of the founding these days, and we think the central threat in a way is this new evolution of the left. Probably starts in the 60s, although it has roots going back farther. And that's multiculturalism as an ideology. Now, most people, or a lot of people, the term's not perfect. We like it because it's comprehensive and suggests an ideology, but it's confusing to some. I mean, when a lot of people think multicultural, they think, what are you against? Immigrants, good food, and cultural diversity? That's crazy. You guys are nuts. But when we mean it as an ideology, we really mean it wrapped up with this new identity politics and political correctness,
right.
Sort of suite of approaches to politics. And it's the latest evolution of modern progressivism, which we've been arguing against it's been around for a century, but we've been arguing against it since at least the early 90s. And it's sort of the newest and most virulent form of that. So it takes all of the apparatus of progressivism, the modern administrative state that tends to rule by expert and judges beyond the reach of politics, and it marries it to this insane obsession with identity based on race, gender, sexual orientation, and really seeks to divide Americans along group lines rather than providing any sort of common American identity or citizenship that might unite us. So we think introducing that kind of discord and inflaming it really is a threat to the success and preservation of our American way of life.
Yeah, I mean, the name of the article is "Defend America, Defeat Multiculturalism." It's pretty.
Yeah, we like subtle titles over here at the.
Well, as a total side note, it's like, as a publisher myself, I get annoyed at having to do, you want to say clickbait, but like just names and titles that are going to just drive engagement. You got to furious and this and outrage that. And I really just want to put out the main subject and just hope everyone clicks on it. But that is not the way the human mind works. And that is not the way social media game works. So guys, forgive me if I ever present something that looks clickbaity. I swear there's meat inside. Just give it a shot. So Defend America, Defeat Multiculturalism. You, in that article, you guys, you yourself, the author, put the struggle against multiculturalism on the same level as Lincoln defending the Union and in the Civil War and abolishing slavery. Can you make that argument for the listeners that may not be familiar?
Yeah, and I'll say, the equation of the two is not to draw some moral equivalence, full stop, between the problem of slavery and this problem of weaponized identity politics. But it's really to say the broader point is that this is a question about the fundamental things we think about our politics, the human nature, what it means for what we do in politics, what it means for how political coalitions should work, how they should look, what it means for citizenship and voting. So it's sort of in the old political science sense, a regime question. We disagree. We've written a bit about us being now in a cold civil war. And I think what we mean by that is not all, I think the broad swath of middle America or just normal Americans don't think about politics, thank God, every day in and day out. They're not doing this for a living like you and I are in some ways. So I don't mean to paint a too broad a brush with the normal citizenry who kind of have a notion of this kind of thing, but are not quite sure how to think about it. But really, the elites driving our political conflict. There's just this huge divide that goes to the core of humanity and justice, and that's what we meet. So that Lincoln talked about a house divided during the slavery crisis, and he talked about, look, one side thinks slavery is right and should be extended. The other side thinks it's wrong and should be, at the time he said not squelched permanently, but really pared back, slowed down, and put on the course of ultimate extinction. So that's what he meant by this sort of regime crisis. And I think we're a house divided on questions of justice, just as we were in the 1850s, although it's different, of course. We're not fighting over enslaving a good portion of our citizenry.
No, we're not. But at the same time, if you read your Kurt Vonnegut, you can see how this stuff carries out into the future. And I wrote in my book that it's the redistribution of oppression. And so, basically this new regime, this new ideology is devouring liberty and redistributing oppression. And, in your essay, you lay out an argument that I would like to learn more about, and I would like more people to pick up on it, is that really what we're facing are two competing versions of justice. And that is not something that can be maintained for a long time. Can you explain that a little bit, please?
Yeah. I mean, the old imperfect in implementation, of course, as the whole slavery controversy shows, maybe more than anything else. But the old way of American justice was to view it in its ideal as the equal protection of equal rights. So we're all not gods and we're all not beasts. We at least know that about humanity. And that means that we shouldn't rule each other without our consent. And that means we should protect, and government should protect, the equal rights that we have under the law. That's the ideal of American justice at a certain baseline. And I think underlying that is a view of human nature. We can know what humans are. We can know the difference between beasts or gods, however you conceive of gods. And we can sort of know that we have this equality at that basic level. As Lincoln said, not equal in talents, not equal in virtue, not equal in intelligence, but equal in being equally human. So that means certain things for government. It means, among other things, limited government, because unlimited government ultimately it will abuse rights. Doesn't mean small government, I should say, especially these days. But and then the other view is the view of the multiculturalists or the identity politics left, is that no, really, we're not really, the most fundamental thing about us is not our individual equality of rights. In fact, it's differences amongst groups, it's histories of oppression, as you said, and it's about taking the former oppressor group and taking it down a couple notches, redistributing goods, services, honors, and prestige to the formerly oppressed groups. And as we see from the attack of modern liberalism, even in the last 10 years, that intersectional basket is constantly changing. My colleague Bill Vogley, I don't know if he did this in print or not, but he talked about the oppression Olympics. It's kind of, it's hard to know who's on top and who's on the bottom, and it's hard to know who ought to decide those things. But that's kind of this, that's what's devouring the left right now, or the thing they're trying to sort out in the primary and elsewhere, is how do we decide, on what basis do we decide who's the most oppressed and who's the most, or the biggest oppressor. I think the left kind of agrees that the biggest oppressor are straight white males. Yeah, you and I. So that's the only thing they can agree on. I think the rest of it is up for grabs.
Yeah. What's interesting, what's really fascinating about your experiences and mine, as I see it, is that I don't have a background in political science or even in philosophy. I was a philosophy major for like a half a year at university. And then I read Marx and I was like, economics sounds important. Let me learn about that. So I got a degree in economics. But I got into all this stuff, 10 years ago after my divorce, starting to learn about the dating markets and the mating markets and marriage, and then feminism, and then intersectionality. So like I started in the trenches, just trying to figure out how to rebuild my life after my divorce. And as I kept pulling on the string, it just kept leading me all the way through into radical feminism, intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, how all of those theories now have infiltrated through academia and the media, and through a very highly leveraged and effective minority has implemented them into federal policy, which then, just spreads all across the land and changes basically fundamental nature of human interactions, especially on college campuses, for example. So I've been able to follow this path all the way to sort of the same point that you guys did, assuming your path was a little bit different than mine, given the your educational and history of the institution. But then we came sort of to the same conclusion, which is that this identity politics, intersectionality, radical feminism, all of this crazed pandering to identity politics is a fundamental and existential threat to everything that we've got going on here. And for the longest time, for me, it felt like I was a crazy person talking about war on men and war on masculinity, because at the heart of all of this stuff is an attack on masculinity, because masculinity is the source of male power. Male power is the source of oppression. All societies have been patriarchal. All of them have been oppressive, and therefore male power is like the root of it, and we need to attack it. And that's what's been happening. And I guess I was thinking I was a crazy person until the APA came out last year with their pathologizing of masculinity, saying that risk-taking and competitiveness and such are sicknesses and need to be cured, basically. And then hearing the language of radical feminism ring out in the judiciary hearings, the confirmation hearings for Kavanaugh. So that's when I was like, okay, this is all not just a fever dream that I'm having, and it's actually all real, and it's happening everywhere, and it's infiltrated our governments in the highest levels of the land, talking about the Supreme Court, etc. So I'm fascinated by the work that you guys are doing, because it's like just this collision and confirmation, I think, that we're all sort of on the same path and we see things the same way. Now, I doubt that everybody around you in your think tank ideasphere universe is accepting of your ideas as I may be. What has been the reaction of your sort of think tank cohorts that are around you that engage and respond with Claremont? What do they think about your identification of multiculturalism as an existential threat and something that needs to be a highlight and a focus for us?
Yeah, well, the one of the interesting that piece that you mentioned, defeat multiculturalism, defend America, or the other way around, I forget.
Yeah.
You write these things and title these things, and you wonder, wait, did I write that? No. But no, I think the most a couple of interesting responses. One from Peter Myers, a friend, an academic, was he said he didn't want. He basically said this is different than the civil rights struggle. That was a noble thing. So we ought to be careful about how we talk about this. But the more poignant critique was from Peter Berkowitz, who is involved with Hoover and actually is now, I think, still at the State Department head of policy planning. He replaced Chiron Skinner, another Hoover colleague of his. But that's neither here nor there. But he's an interesting guy and an academic by training. But he wanted to say, look, it's not a regime. Multiculturalism is not a regime. It's not a way of life. It's not as comprehensive as you say. If we're not clear in our categories, then we're misdiagnosing the problem. But I would say in the rank and file of our donors and our friends and our political actors, especially amongst the sort of more Trumpy crowd or pro-Trump folks, it all makes perfect sense to them. They may, especially when you say what I mean by multiculturalism is identity politics, they all agree that this is a weaponized form of divide and conquer that really can't end well. And even if you see polling on identity politics nationwide, nobody really likes it. I mean, it's sort of 60-40 against, to the extent that people know what it is. So I think there's a lot of political and rhetorical hay to be made by raising this question in that way. It's partly why we raised it. But more importantly, I think it was for us the latest evolution of this century-old project of progressivism to sort of undermine Americanism and constitutionalism at its root. So we understand it in that sort of the evolved century of liberalism as the latest instantiation of it. And in many ways, the most troubling version of it. I mean, you mentioned Marx. It is it's a little too clean, but it is a kind of cultural Marxism. So we
Yes.
shouldn't be surprised that the economic justice left, the Bernie of old has now become the identity politics warrior of Bernie 2.0. He's easily transitioned from the old Marxism to the new cultural Marxism.
Yeah, that's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out in 2020 if he is indeed the nominee. I think that in 2016 there were a number of Bernie supporters who, well, in fact, I chronicled a number of them in depthly in my book, who were burned through the primary process, including one woman who was a Bernie delegate in Nevada, went through the caucuses there, saw how Hillary basically stole that from him, then went to Philadelphia, saw how they treated them there, and then just quit the Democratic Party, voted for Trump. Yeah. But I don't think she's going to go back to Bernie in 2020 if he's the nominee, partly because she's already gone through the fire and seen the light. Mm-hmm. Secondly, because he's so vastly different now with this, a racist nation from top to bottom. I just was floored when I heard him say that in the last or a couple debates ago. I hope that's something that people never let him forget, because if that's your attitude, why do you even want to be leader of this country? And then, right. What are you going to do? What are you going to do when you get there? I wanted to circle back to something you said just a minute ago about the polling on identity politics or multiculturalism. I think that in a very easy and quick survey, people will be like, oh, I'm for it, I'm against it, or whatever. But if you sit there and you really explain to them how it is permeating every element of our society and our laws and our money and jobs and relationships and fertility and household formation and all kinds of things, then I think that they would start to have a more negative perception of it, one would hope. But, they just, rationally speaking, I'm not talking down to anybody. It's like, if you're not full-time political professional, it doesn't make any sense to even pay attention to any of this crap. So it's not a pejorative. It's like, I understand why people don't talk about it or don't think about it. So there is an element of education that needs to take place. And I'm guessing that's part of what you guys are trying to do as well, too, just sort of explain how it is everywhere.
Yeah. And it's, I would say normal Americans, it's not on their radar. And I mean, as you said, non-pejoratively, I mean, only the best things when I say normal Americans.
Right. With envy.
Who just, raise their kids and make a living and improve their communities. But unless, like you, the full weight of the modern regime comes down on them, either through, social ostracization, running them out of their jobs. I mean, anyone that works for an employer with over 15 employees is at risk of getting caught up in this modern apparatus that's driven by identity politics. My colleague Chris Caldwell has a new book out. It sounds like a book on entitlements because it's called The Age of Entitlement in America since the 60s. But really, it's about how the Civil Rights Act of 1964, though it was designed to address this discrete injustice of Jim Crow and segregation, quickly through the courts and through administrative agencies, got taken up as a generalized vehicle for identity politics and for the enforcement of the ruling class's notions of justice, redistribution, honors, prestige, whether it was based on race, the original problem that it was meant to deal with, or sex, which is also in the law, but then now quickly gender, sexual identity, and on and on and on. There seems to be no limiting principle about it. It seems to just be based on, and I wanted to bring up this fancier point earlier, the difference between these two worldviews. The old worldview, and it's not just the founders, but an older tradition and one that continued past them, was that we can know reasonably through the exercise of our reason what's right and wrong, what politics ought to pursue and what it ought not to pursue. Whereas I think the new way of understanding politics and power, whether it be Marxist or early progressives or historicist or now the modern identity politics left, is really, it's not based on reason, it's based on will. If I'm a group, big enough group, and I will something or desire something, and I've been historically oppressed, and I'm due rights, I'm due recognition. And ultimately, if you go down that road far enough, Chris puts it this way in his book, every new right that's created, I would add, Chris doesn't say this, but I would add especially one that has a basis in this new notion of group will or power rather than reason, every new right you add, has to come at the expense of someone else's rights. That older notion of rights, of natural rights of the founding, meant that these were rights that we all had a duty to protect amongst our fellow citizens, and the government had the right to protect for us. They were kind of negative rights. But when rights become these things that I'm owed materially and as a matter of dignity, it becomes a sort of a war of all against all, of all identity groups against all identity groups. And if you end up on top, that's good. If you're on the bottom, it's not as good.
Yeah. That's an interesting perspective, because thinking about it now, if the whole thing is basically about taking from one to give to another rather than providing an environment that everybody has the same chances, if it becomes taking from one and giving to another, deep inside people have to understand that they're actually like making a taking on people, right? And if you're going to be taking something from someone, or parallel this with like a war conflict, it's like you have to stop thinking of them as a human, right? Because if you thought of somebody as a human being with rights and they're just entitled to their liberty and all of that, you would be less inclined to just want to take something from them, snatch things from them. So there has to be some element of dehumanization and sort of turning them into monsters, which is, I think, part of why the straight white hetero guy is being so demeaned and degraded today, because how else can you justify to yourself taking something from someone if you don't think that they're somehow undeserving or subhuman or some sort of manifestation of evil or something like that. And you can see that in this in the media and in the discourse and in the language and in the anger and the vitriol. And of course, they deflect it by saying, "Oh no, it's just a structural thing. It's not like individuals doing it." But come on, I mean, the whole structure is built up of individuals. What are you talking about?
Mm-hmm. No, and it gets back to, Madison in the Federalist says that the first object of government is to protect the unequal faculties of folks, because it will lead to unequal results. I think the modern left. And look, we can bracket all this and say, of course, at the time, a huge portion of the population was enslaved. So, and at a principled level, the founders knew that and knew it was a problem. But he nonetheless said, in the best sense, government needs to protect our ability to acquire property, to pursue our happiness. And we're not all blessed with the same gifts, talents, and ability to do all that. So if you take that as the baseline of just human nature, which I think most sane people would, we're all. We can do a lot through habit and acquisition of talent stacking. I listened to your Scott Adams
thanks.
podcast. That we can all improve ourselves, of course, but I'm no Einstein in intellectual pursuits, and I'm no Jackie Robinson in my ability to play baseball. So I'll always have unequal sports achievements with Jackie Robinson, and I will always be intelligently and mentally unequal to Albert Einstein. But the modern left, I think, sees any group difference or group disparity as the result of oppression or structural racism or institutional racism, as they say. So, if your goal is to eradicate that fundamental fact of human nature, the only way to really do it is through a sort of unlimited state and a really tyrannical pursuit of the quashing of human nature. And that is the same project as the great tyrannies of the middle of the 20th century. And that's why we don't think we're being histrionic or a little hyperbolic when we say, look, down this road lies something really bad, even though it's not, Bernie's not out there advocating, gulags, and some of his supporters might be, but gulags, the Bernie bros, are all excited about the gulag, as we know from James O'Keefe's reporting. But Sanders isn't out there trying to nationalize the railroads or create bread lines and gulags and death camps. But the logic of this way of doing politics and this denial of human difference and messiness is really frightening. And we've been down this road before. We had a different avenue towards it, but it's doesn't end well.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. There's a parallel conversation going on in biology and psychology right now about, the biological differences between men and women and large populations and such, and how the data and the science seems to keep marching steadily towards, empirical hard evidence that there's differences between men, women, and large populations and whatever. And maybe they're generally the same, but there are certainly group differences. And there's a huge pushback against acknowledging that, right? And this is where, the denial of science and reason gets alarming for me. And this is why some of these issues of radical feminism and the transgender issue and such become such flashpoints, because they really emphasize and highlight how modern left is just tossing science into the trash can in order to keep advancing the goals that they have, which is to basically make it so that everybody everywhere is the same in all ways at all times with the same outcomes and the same successes. And so this battle, this struggle, is actually happening on a number of different levels across the country, various layers, whether it's academia or in politics or whether it's in science. And it does seem to me that there is a growing resistance to these ideas. And I do see that there's like a new coalescing. I mean, we see that there's new parties sort of emerging, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, very different. And one of the ways that I've seen that one of the common traits to divide these two groups now would be sort of the blank slaters versus people that believe in some element of biological determinism. Now, if you believe in determinism, it doesn't mean you believe in superiority. You just believe in admitting and acknowledging that there are differences in preferences and desires and risk tolerances and such. And if you're a blank slatist, you think, everybody's born the same and it's just society does it to you. Mm-hmm. And so I'm seeing sort of a joining. I guess that's why the Evo Site guys are popular with the red pill community and sort of more reactionary politics and such. And it does make for some unsavory bedfellows at times. But are you seeing sort of a growing pushback? Do you see the group that can identify multiculturalism, identity politics, intersectionality as a problem is growing? Or are we still on the fringes? What's your prognostication on that? What's happening and where are we going and who's on the team?
Well, I think I think it is growing. Helped immeasurably by what seems to be the galloping radicalization of the left, especially at the national political level and on the campuses. And look, we got to be honest. At basically all of the commanding heights of our culture. Right. The only place that some semblance of right-wingery has real national control is in politics. And even there, I think half the team doesn't understand the problem. Right. This new way of thinking about human nature and justice has taken over the HR departments at all of our major corporations. It's certain now it's, New York Times and the 1619 Project, it's coming to if it wasn't already there, it's coming with a vengeance to a K through 12 classroom near you. Yeah,
my school where my daughter goes to school right here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, so I think people are waking up to this. The political establishment is it's a mixed bag, as it always is. I mean, to the extent that many of them who see Trump as a real inflection point and see the future of right-wing politics in America as a little more populist, a little more nationalist, a little more, for lack of a better term, Trumpian, are trying to figure out a way forward that both rhetorically and then policy-wise that resonates with what ways in which we ought to steer us towards a more just national political life. But then there's a good portion of the Republican establishment and even part of the think tank world that seems to think, we're still in the realm of really just procedural disagreements, incrementalism. Don't get too excited. This regime of self-government we have is fine. We're doing better than ever materially. Why are you all so freaked out? Whereas I think you and I and many others, increasing numbers, both at the grassroots level and at the elite level on the right, are pretty alarmed at the trajectory of our modern divide and the modern left.
Yeah, I think it is true that it is growing, and it's growing in various different sectors, like I said before. So it might be interesting to see about how we can unite, just identify the various sort of industries and intellectual genres that are encountering the issues presented by these theories, and then try to, if we use like a common denominator of discourse, we can attract people from the various silos onto the same theme. And it's something that just came to mind while I was talking to you, because really we need the evo psych and biologist guys to really get louder and get more voice in the matter, because we need people to understand it. It's just a physical impossibility for everyone to end up with the same outcomes. And so making that as a goal is a disaster. And you know what I find? I watch these guys like Eric and Brett Weinstein. They're like having these public journeys. They're red pilling like right in front of your very eyes, but then they're just afraid to take the plunge at the end of the day because they still have some level of Trump derangement syndrome. And I'm just hoping that guys like them and others will continue to do the intellectual work and maybe work through the emotional baggage that comes along with this idea of supporting Trump, the madman, who's not really. And be able to come out publicly on the other end. It'll be interesting to see what they recommend for their audiences and stuff to do in the 2020 election. I'm getting the sense there's some people who are willing to sit it out. And I said, well, you're free riding on me then, because I'm out here with my name and getting arrows in my back, but you're going to just sit it out and go with Trump anyway. But this brings me again to like a further idea here. I wanted to talk to you about how you could harness the power of the Claremont Institute network and the American Mind Network. How are you doing that? How are you expanding that? And then after that, I'm going to follow up with you on that on Bronze Age Pervert. Okay.
Sure. Yeah, I think just as a quick aside, and I know you agree with this, I think rhetorically, while we talk about the emerging science of genetics and group differences and all this stuff, we need to keep repeating that no matter the source of group differences and outcomes, it doesn't mean anything for the equal rights of equal citizens. And the only way we can sort of accept this new and increasing realm of science and what it tells us about human achievement and populations and evolutionary history and all that, the only way we can approach that responsibly as Republican small r citizens is to also maintain at the same time, look, that your identity position has nothing to do with the equal protection of your rights. So I think the modern left is rightfully quite scared of that way of looking at group differences, because if they concede that point at all, and if they marry the truth of that kind of stuff with their project, they have to admit that most of their policy recommendations and their philosophical and scientific attempts to conquer human nature are really futile and are going to wind up hurting more people than they help. So that's the psychology of it, I think. And you see it, you've seen it, of course, with Charles Murray decided to wade back into this debate with his new book on human diversity, and it's all in the news again. I just saw Dawkins is now canceled apparently for he's like, I'm not a eugenicist. Eugenicism is horrible, but of course there are group differences and people are calling him a Nazi. It's pretty wild. But yeah, what are we doing? We're, we launched the American Mind in October of 2018, and we're having a lot of fun with it. I mean, we wanted to, our quarterly magazine is kind of like I said about the Claremont Institute, it's sort of one foot in the academic world, one foot in the political world. It reviews books. It has essays on culture, history, and politics. It's kind of highbrow. I shouldn't say kind of. It's pretty highbrow. It's wonderfully edited. My colleague Charles is a brilliant man and a brilliant editor. But we wanted a little more space to engage an online audience, engage a younger audience, be a little more piratical, and a little more online, as the kids say. But at the same time, maintain this focus of ours, which is on ideas and how they drive politics. So that's the sense in which it still has a foot firmly planted in what we've always done. But we wanted a little more leeway, both in terms of timing and news cycle, but also in terms of just the spirit of the thing to have a little more fun, be a little more fast and loose while maintaining this seriousness about politics and ideas. So that's been a great success for the first year. it's made a real impression amongst our friends and fellow travelers who do this for a living day in and day out. They all report they're looking at it every day, so that's gratifying. We launched a couple of podcast products, and we'll have more coming. We're trying to engage more with our alumni audience, which, about 300 of whom are in Washington doing policy and ideas work and politics. And then we have, I mentioned it, it actually cropped up in this article Park McDougald wrote for Tablet about us, partly about us. I mentioned to him, mostly by background, but he put it in the piece, but it's okay. We're working on a new center, which will launch in Washington, D.C. soon. I don't have an exact date, called the Center for the American Way of Life, where we really get 2 feet on the ground in Washington and try to confront these, what we think are these real regime threats at the domestic level, and even some at the foreign level, and talk to lawmakers about them, and try to talk in a responsible but urgent way about this extent to which they really could bring down the country. And we think that sense of urgency is sometimes lacking in Washington, D.C. today, especially in the think tank world. So we'd like to address that, or fill that gap, and work with, there's tons of good policy work being done out there. We'd like to be a clearinghouse, discussion center, distribution center, and then really sort of, laboratory for figuring out how we ought to think together with lawmakers and political opinion leaders about how we get ourselves out of this mess. So that's all the projects we're working on. We're having fun.
I think that's a great idea, and I would urge you to try to capture the network power of your alumni and your fellows and your contributors, and try to engage them as best as possible, as frequently as possible in a private community. Somehow get them all together, email lists, chats, forums, like anything that you can do to build that network and get people connected to each other, and understand that as a network grows, the power doesn't just grow linearly; it grows even better than that. And it's important to continue working on the networks, which is something that I'm trying to do myself more on like a grassroots level, right? Like trying to recruit gentlemen for the liminal order that have the same worldview. But rather than trying to figure out how we're going to affect policy or lobby or even take a firm political position, we're trying to figure out how does a male citizen in America, fight back against these issues, and what's the best course of action for us as individuals that would ultimately lead to positive outcomes for the nation. Yeah, and so that's our effort on the ground. And if the last 6 months is anything predictive of the future, the liminal order is going to just continue to grow because the demand for it is just ridiculous. And every time anybody learns about it, they're very fascinated. We've got almost 1,500 people on the waiting list right now. We're opening up the doors for membership again on March 1st. And there's just a ton of people that want to get involved because I think they feel as though that it's addressing an urgently missing element in their life. And they're also tired of being surrounded by people that don't understand the problem and don't see the threat. And they're ready to take action. And I don't want them taking public action. We will never do any sort of public demonstration, never any, direct confrontation. I don't even want these guys posting on social media or whatever. I want them to keep it a secret. Keep their heads off the chopping block, let people like you and me stick it out there, get the arrows right in the back, sometimes a knife in the back also. And just, for our gentlemen in liminal order, just try to become the best versions of themselves that they could possibly be. So, and I'm seeing the power of that myself. So I would urge you to explore that also with your existing network. And what I do like to see, I'm really happy to hear about the Washington, D.C. Center. That's right in my neck of the woods. So maybe we'll be out this way a little bit more frequently. And then B, the expansion. And, we got to talk about Bronze Age Pervert, okay? Because have you guys having Bronze Age Pervert's book reviewed by Michael Anton, and then a series of articles and essays, a symposium, I guess is the word for that, all on the same subject. Yeah. That to me, combined with hosting Curtis Yarvin and having Jack Posobiec as a fellow, that was like a big signal to me that you guys understood the landscape and were really interested in engaging with sort of your grassroots population. So can you tell me how the Bronze Age Pervert connection came to be? What the impact was for that for you? Did you take any heat for it? How did it all work out? Would you do it again? Was it positive? Tell us the Bronze Age Pervert story.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, that book had been bouncing around especially the under 30 crowd. I guess I would say on the right, but that's even a little too cramped a way of putting it. And, this weird little book that's sort of, as Mike puts it, it's kind of message board pigeon. Has a weird grammatical structure. It's kind of hilarious at times and very avant-garde on matters of, populations and race at other times, to say the least. This thing, for whatever its faults or virtues as a piece of work, it kept cropping up amongst the young folks on the right, and as an interesting phenomenon. So we wanted to, our especially the audience for the magazine, this term gets thrown around way too much, but our audience is very boomerish for the Claremont Review books. They're folks who've been in the trenches of American political warfare and intellectual warfare for 40 years or so. Not all, but a lot of them. And we thought a lot of them really had no idea what the hell this thing was, and we wanted to talk about it a bit, talk about it as a youth phenomenon, and talk about it, what it might mean, and hopefully we hoped inform how some of our older peers, fellow travelers, et cetera, talked about politics and took seriously this energy amongst the young on the right that was sort of up for grabs. And we also wanted to engage, and this was really more the goal of the engagement or the symposium. We call them features, where we have a discussion week in and week out on a piece on the American mind, which was to engage some of BAP's audience, Bronze Age Pervert's audience, where the right goes is up in the air right now. And I think those of us at Claremont who've always tried to focus on the importance of human equality, broadly speaking, and equal rights and their protection in the old sense, not in the modern identity politics sense. Part of the danger on the young right is to say, look, this whole establishment, right and left, is so corrupt. The only thing that makes sense to me is this kind of reactionary politics. We think in many ways that's kind of a dead end. I don't know. I don't mean to suggest that's what BAP's advocating for. That's a piece of political philosophical art standing on its own in a way. And he tried to answer some of that in the response. But we just wanted to stir things up and to show, the audience for this kind of stuff amongst the young on the right, that we weren't just sort of fusionist Reagan Republicans just rehashing the arguments from 30 years ago. We were open to new ideas and wanted to engage with them. We still have our point of view, which we'd like to push and persuade people of about how they ought to think about America and Americans. But we think it's important to not be afraid of the arguments that are gaining some traction on the right. So the same would be said of Curtis Yarvin, who kind of made his public debut again, as it were, on the American mind. And Curtis is a little different. I mean, he's as his old readers know, a very smart guy, very heterodox. Has plenty of views that we don't necessarily agree with about the trajectory or the status of modern American government, but he's been a pretty interesting diagnostician of the what would you call it? The kind of weird conformist neoliberal statist consensus on right and left that seems to be shaping Western European and American politics. We think in a bad way, or a stultifying way, or a way that sort of, it's sort of a see no evil, hear no evil, and just keep plowing forward with globalism and no borders and woke liberalism, and everything will be fine. Curtis questions all that in a unique and very eclectic way, and so it's fun to engage him on that and have him reach some new readers and to at some point continue the conversation.
Yeah, well, whereas Bronze Age Pervert, and did you ever think that you would use the word pervert over and over again in your professional life? Yeah. Bronze Age Pervert definitely has a connection to the young guys, and he definitely has his own audience for sure.
Yeah.
And he can throw traffic around the internet pretty easy. But it's funny. He and I come from sort of the same background online. We populated the same forums and message groups and stuff as far back as like 2009. So he and I together have come up through whatever the internet is producing, we're it, right? Like we were educated on a lot of these subjects. We connected with people who had similar views. And then, you post a lot first in a forum, and then you build a blog, and then you get around to writing a book. And before you know it, you're talking to the president of the Claremont Institute, and the other guy's got his book being reviewed by American Mind, right? So it's pretty, actually, that whole phenomenon is kind of fascinating to me, how Jack Murphy is a pen name, but now it's basically my real name. Right. I feel strange introducing myself by my first name, John, anymore. But it's amazing how, like, basically two anonymous guys come up through internet message boards and pick up on all of these signals and trends and make an analysis and take their own approach. And then we all have converged here in 2020. And it's really actually fascinating. And I commend you guys for being aware. I mean, you're not a boomer, dude. I'm looking right at you. You're like Gen X, just like me, I think.
Barely, yeah. Just
barely. Oh, you a young Gen Xer?
I was born in '81, so the generational folks insist that I'm a millennial, but I refuse that label.
Yeah,
I grew up without the internet for at least 8 or 9 years. So
okay, we'll let you in.
That can't make me a millennial, can it?
No, I mean, Gen X is without a doubt the cool kids club in the whole universe right now, and you're definitely in it.
Thanks,
but I commend you guys for reaching out and acknowledging and seeing that there is a connection to be made between your high level academic and political stuff and the grassroots stuff that's coming up as a function specifically. Well, as Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. I mean, our whole thrust is you can't separate it from social media and from blog posting, podcasting, and stuff like that. So I commend you for that. And Curtis Yarvin in particular is somebody that we know, you can presume that based on, we know Bannon used to read him. We knew Bannon had Trump's ears. We know that those ideas are in the White House. People who are in the White House have read Curtis Yarvin. I even know guys there that read BAP too. So like these pieces are in Washington. They're in the West Wing. Oh, yeah. They're in the minds of Trump's advisors, and I would not be surprised if he wouldn't be familiar with those names as well if asked directly. The next name would be Jack Posobiec. I wanted to talk to you about. Jack's a good friend of mine. I met him, I guess around the time of the Deplorball, maybe. And we've just gotten to be friends since then. And I'm very proud of what he's been able to do. He's just such a good guy, and he's doing such good work. How did his fellowship come to be? And did you face any pushback from that? Or was it, I mean, I just imagine you got the boomers all around you, and you're dropping names like Pervert and Moldbug and Posobiec. How was that for Jack and for you guys? And, how are you looking to expand the fellowship program in the future?
Yeah, I want to tie it back to just a piece of Bronze Age Pervert. Some pushback we got on doing that review was from, he'll remain nameless, but he's good and representative. A sort of late 20s staffer working in Congress at a pretty high level, saying, "Come on, why are you guys giving a platform to Bronze Age Pervert?" I mean, and I made the case that I just made to you and that well. And he said, "I don't know, it just seems like we can get caught up in this very online existence and think it's a bigger deal than it is." And my message to him, which I didn't quite get the chance to say to him directly, but I think you'll agree with it, is, and you expressed it, which is, yes, the very online is its own thing, but it's a increasingly huge thing. And our digital landscape is displacing the old forms of media. It's driving the sort of disintermediation of the media. Trump has poured fuel on that fire by delegitimizing the media for good reason in many respects. So, we just have to take this landscape seriously and not just write it off as a weird message board thing, because it may have been that 15 years ago, but it's certainly not that now.
Definitely not.
Yeah. And then Jack came to us because, well, first of all, he applied to the fellowship, like everyone else, or like a lot of people, made a compelling case for why he wanted to learn what we taught, and came recommended. Jack does not have a non-controversial history of reporting and sort of media stuff. He's part of this online community that you've described, and as you discussed with Jack, made it transition from Game of Thrones persona commentator to political commentating to now a media career. So we thought all that was very interesting. We knew that he was going to be a controversial pick, but decided if we hadn't had the solid recommendation from a few friends we trusted, we might have taken a pass, just given the controversy surrounding Jack's rise to fame and infamy and media influence. But of course, once he was at the fellowship, as you knew before I did, he was nothing but a gentleman and respectful and engaged discussant in our seminar and a family man and everything else. People can get a pretty warped view of folks by just reading online, as another retort to the very online quip from our friend. We got pushback, but mostly from the Never Trump crowd, this was just the latest example of our unseriousness, our selling out to the Trump MAGA world and the new media, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, we know what we were about. We still were teaching the same old things we always taught, trying to figure out how to navigate American politics in a principled way and teach that to people, but acknowledging the fact of the matter that this new media landscape has to be engaged with. The people who are influential within it. It doesn't need to be all of our fellows now, but to neglect this growing cohort of people with huge influence, many of them more influence than Brian Stelter, we can never doubt for sure, or even some of them a little more influence than Tucker Carlson are coming up to approach that. Maybe Jack, not yet, but we got to engage with that community and try to teach them. And to the extent that they come to us and say, hey, I want to learn what you guys teach, we're very open to that and unafraid.
That's exciting. And I think that's wise strategy. And I'm particularly interested myself too. I'm going to be submitting application, just so you know, Ryan. All right. That's awesome. And, there was another thing that happened to you recently that's pretty awesome. You went to the White House and received a pretty prestigious award. Tell everybody about that, would you? What was that like? What was the award? How did that come about? And how was the experience?
Yeah, I got a call from John Peedy, the head of the National Endowment for the Humanities, earlier this year, letting us know that we'd been nominated by the president to receive a National Humanities Medal. We, of course, accepted immediately. It was a great honor. So I went out to Washington with a group of my board members, and we did the whole East Wing ceremony, had a photo op with the president and the first lady, and then the main stage event alongside our fellow recipients. And, this is one of the instances in my life where I happen to be lucky and at the right place at the right time. They weren't acknowledging me, of course. They're just acknowledging the 4 decades of work Claremont's done. And I just happened to be president at the time. So it was a surreal day, to be sure. And my favorite moment was, I was sitting behind Trump so I could see when he was riffing off the teleprompter. And he said, oh, Claremont Institute, they've been working to restore the principles of the founding, teaching and writing for 40 years and to recover the American idea. And he pauses and goes, I know it well. That was it was just a wonderful example behind the scenes, quasi behind the scenes. I was behind the scenes of just, Trump's great comedic timing and his knowing his audience. It was kind of charming. It's a side of him that I think, the folks who just get outraged about his Twitter persona or are in the grip of Never Trumpism or TDS, don't really get to see. But in person, he's a pretty warm, friendly, and charming guy.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. I mean, I saw him on Oprah back in the 80s when she told him to run for president. I'll never forget that. That's exciting. Do you think that the Trump administration, by doing that now, was giving you any kind of nod about your engagement with the younger guys, with the big online guys, with the Posobiecs, the perverts, the Yarvins of the world? Given that we've established that he probably is familiar with their work. I mean, we know he knows Jack. He's retweeted him several times, and I'm sure Jack's connection to him is, sort of regular. Yeah. Do you think this was an acknowledgement of that, or do you think it was in the cake, a couple of years ago? Or
no, I think it. No, it bubbled up just this year, in that process. So, or I hear rumors. So, but I don't know whether it reflects how much it reflects our engagement with the new online media right. But I think it was, it's a reflection of I think our willingness from an institutional base that's cultivated a kind of reputation for seriousness over many decades, our willingness to sort of take this new political phenomenon of Trump, try to understand it without being hysterical, and then to continue to try to influence American political and public life for the good. I think if you look at those medal recipients, for the most part, it was kind of a new breed. I mean, I don't know if I would have seen any previous White House having, the president of the Claremont Institute and James Patterson, novelist up there. I think it reflected Trump's sort of desire to do things in a little more populist fashion. Folks that are out there speaking to real issues to real Americans, and we were doing a little more of that recently, and then we also just have this long history of being really engaged in the humanities business in our own kind of non-institutional way, just from a freestanding nonprofit. So, we got some pushback on that too. My favorite was we got an angry voicemail from some woman in Pennsylvania saying, how dare we accept, well, first of all, she thought we got the arts medal, which was the wrong one. She said, I looked at your website. You don't have anything to do with the arts. I've called my senator and the White House. How dare you? First of all, I thought it was funny, how dare we accept a prize? But it was reflective of, if you saw all that from the outside and you did a quick online perusal of our footprint, you'd go, what in the hell? But right. It made sense to people who knew us, and I think it made sense to the White House.
Well, congratulations on that. That must have been fun. I don't know to what extent you use it as a signal that you guys are on the right track, but I certainly think that you are. And I know we only have a few more minutes here, and I wanted to wrap up with one last thing, which would be, lately it seems like you guys have been writing a lot about Trumpism after Trump, mm-hmm. and that's like a subject that people are discussing. To what extent do you think that the ideas that he has written into the presidency and hopefully into a second presidency, and some of the policy proposals, or at least just even the concepts or the framework or just even the mindset, how much of that is going to persist after Trump's eventual end of his presidency, whether it's this year or in 4 years?
Yeah. Well, the most intangible part of him is his sense of the media landscape and his sort of showmanship. That's a hard thing. You can't really train that sort of thing. You just kind of have it or you don't, or you've cultivated it from some good base material. So who knows, that side of the national politician that is Trump, or the national political phenomenon that is Trump, pretty hard to replicate. But I think the more important thing is, look, he's the first president since H.W. Bush and really Reagan to win any of those upper Midwest states. I think there's a good chance he wins one more this year than he did in 2016. He's kind of revived the prospects of a blue collar conservatism, and that's a little bit of an anachronistic term, but I mean a new political coalition on the right, the likes of which we haven't really seen in a few decades. And how did he do that? Well, he showed that a certain dexterity with a suite of policies that had been sort of locked in stone on the Republican side, just sort of wrote Reaganism. Not that there's anything wrong with Reagan per se, but his world was a lot different than ours. It was now a long time ago. We have different challenges today. And I think, and this ties us back to the identity politics thing. I think, I wrote on the Federalist that the only way we solve this problem in a way is to keep winning. You have to sort of defeat woke identity politics at the ballot box if you're going to have any hope of defeating it culturally and in the wider sphere. And the only way to do that coalitionally on the right, I think, is to follow Trump's lead, which is to say, cultivating, looking after, standing up for an Americanness and a notion of American citizenship that looks after the middle and working class, that treats borders as a real thing, sovereignty as a real thing, that retreats a little bit from the madness of our endless foreign policy adventurism, and that, is a little, frankly, quite a bit less libertarian economically. That's the way forward. The devil is in the details, of course, and we all should argue vehemently over that policy stack. But I think Trump has shown the way. So the goal for anyone subsequent to Trump should be to take the lessons that he's shown us, to build on that coalition, and to try to dominate American politics for a generation, because that's the way you'll defeat the identity politics leftism that threatens to bring us down.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I agree that it's important. And perhaps one of the failings of the Trump administration is the lack of the the backwards infilling of institution and institutional support.
Huge personnel problem too. Yeah.
Oh God, the personnel problem. I mean, I live in DC, so when Obama was elected, it was just like a tidal wave of people showed up in the town, took over the town, changed the whole tenor of the whole city.
Yeah.
There was none of that when Trump was elected. I was really hoping.
Yeah.
There's like one bar you can go to in DC if you're a Trump supporter and not get harassed or thrown out for being public about that. Whereas Obama just flooded the city, flooded the NGOs, all the institutions, nonprofits, everything, everywhere. There was just a million new people. I would have liked to have seen some of that, but I do believe that these forces at work that propelled Trump to the presidency are tectonic. They're huge. They're massive structural things that aren't going to change in a year or 2 or 5 or 10 even. And in fact, fighting against multiculturalism and intersectionality and all the identity politics is something that's going to take many, many years.
Yeah.
And working these ideas out of academia especially is going to be even more difficult because like critical theory and intersectionality, they become the foundation, the basis for other academic endeavors and other fields of academic thought that are now being infected by this idea. And so we have to work all that out over time. That's going to take a long time, but I really commend you guys for the work that you're doing, the direction that you're taking the organization. I respect it. It got my attention. If the Bronze Age Pervert thing was meant to be a bat signal to the young and new right and the internet right, well, we heard it, we saw it. Here we are. Now we're talking, and I appreciate that as well. And I think that there's going to be a lot of synchronicity between what I'm doing with the liminal order and what you guys are doing on a national scale. And so I look forward to continuing our conversations and getting to know each other a little bit. And, congratulations once again on the award and all the good work you're doing. So thank you very much. And thanks very much for coming on the show, Ryan. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Thanks for all your public spiritedness. America's a better place because of you. So keep doing what you do.
Well, that is very kind of you. Thank you very much. All right, everybody. Where can they find you? What are the websites? Where should they go for more information?
Yeah, our institutional site is Claremont, CLAREMONT.org. Find our magazine at ClaremontReviewBooks.com, and then the online publication, AmericanMind.org. And we're all on Twitter at the usual suspects, at American Mind, at Claremont Inst, all that stuff. So check us out.
What's your Twitter handle? What's yours?
Mine is RPW Williams. That's one drawback of having the third most popular last name in the American language. It had to be a little long, but at RPW Williams is my Twitter handle.
Yeah, I mean, imagine for me trying to come up with a Jack Murphy handle that I hadn't taken already. Well, that's awesome. And guys, everybody else, find me on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Jack Murphy Live. Come to the website, jackmurphylive.com. And if you have any interest in joining the liminal order, please do come to the website and put your name on the waiting list, because you cannot join unless you are on the waiting list. And that email or that website is liminal-order.com. Come on down and join up. You'll get all the information, and you can find out if the LO is for you. So once again, Ryan, thank you so much. Can't wait to see you next time you're out here in Washington, D.C. Hopefully we can get together.